What's up, gamers? It's your host, Cobra, and today we're talking Riot Racers spawning and rental strategy. Now, before we jump in, just a couple of notes on today's video. This is part 2 to my spawning and rental guide, and if you missed part 1, I have linked it for you below. Part 1 focuses on all of the details added to the white paper, and if you aren't familiar with these types of mechanics, you should definitely start there. In fact, if you haven't been paying attention to Riot Racers, you should start there as well. But if you're here for strategy, this is the video for you. Also important to note, while the white paper has a lot of wonderful details that make it much easier for us to speculate how this is going to pay out for everybody, we don't yet know how popular these features are going to be because these features haven't been released yet. So there's quite a bit of speculation here, and if you are considering an investment, make sure you limit it to your own personal risk tolerance, and keep in mind that this is not financial advice. Now, before we jump in, a couple of notes on the terminology. The existing assets today are either from the Genesis collection or the Apollo collection. Those are all considered tier 1 for spawning purposes. If you hear me refer to a tier 2 asset or an Artemis collection asset, those are the resulting offspring of your tier 1 assets. So wanted to clear that up as we go through it so that it's not too complicated. Now we're going to look at the specific numbers here in just a second, but deciding whether or not to spawn a new asset should be relatively simple. The reason is you simply need to compare cars to the Apollo collection or drivers to the driver collection. And if the price is even remotely close, then you should absolutely get the tier 1 asset, meaning the Apollo car or the Genesis driver. And the reason is they're not equal. In fact, an Apollo car is about 25% better than an Artemis car, and there's no Apollo drivers to compare to, so a Genesis driver is a whopping 50% better than an Artemis driver. So you need to apply those factors to the overall cost of spawning. And when we look at the floor prices of any of those assets today, it paints a really clear picture that we don't need spawning yet. Quick programming note, I always put timestamps below so you can skip straight to the section that is most relevant to your search today. Also, double check that you've hit that like and subscribe button now because I know a bunch of you aren't going to make it to the end. So let's jump into the numbers right here, and I have calculated out the total cost in USD as well as in ETH, and then I've also added a column called the compare cost. Now this takes the ETH total and adds the 25 or 50% kicker that we talked about earlier to make it really easy to compare to the floor price of a tier 1 asset and help make that decision. Now keep in mind though that your Artemis collection is also going to be retired after 9 months. So if you're taking a really long-term snapshot, you're going to need to factor that in as well. And the first thing that I noticed when looking at these numbers is that on the low end especially, and for drivers, they are very high. And it's going to take some time and some improvement in the secondary market before it's going to make sense to be spawning any of those assets. However, we can see a few gems in here, specifically the legendary and pro class cars, even with the compare cost uplift, are still cheaper than their Apollo counterparts. Now that's not too surprising for a few reasons. The recent updates to the white paper helped solidify how much more valuable those higher class cars are, and we've seen a nice size bump in the floor for those assets. But they're also the most scarce of the car assets out there, so it makes sense that their price has stayed higher compared to the rest of the market. So if you're starting out, and what I'm thinking on day one is that I'm going to spawn a pro car and a legendary car, probably, maybe 2 pro cars. But I'm going to hold off on spawning anything else until the numbers start to make sense. Next, let's jump into the even more exciting update, rentals. Now, I am more excited about rentals than spawning for one very clear reason. The numbers today tell me that rentals are going to be more lucrative on day 1 than spawning will be for all of the reasons that we just covered. However, that is going to be a scale that goes back and forth because the better that the rentals are doing, the more valuable your tier 1 cars are going to become, and eventually those prices will rise and the cost of spawning will start to make more sense. And I could even foresee a day when we might have owners that are doing a lot of spawning just to flip those assets because they are also worth more than the cost of spawning. But we're talking about rentals right now, and I am quite excited about rentals because at the moment I own about a dozen cars and about half a dozen drivers, and although I do play Riot Racers pretty much every day at this point, there's just no chance I'm going to be able to use up all of the stamina for all of those assets every single day. And once rentals starts, if you're not using all of your stamina for all of your assets every single day, you're just flat out losing money. And nobody wants to do that. So let's talk about how we can avoid that scenario. So let's jump into some numbers straight away. And over here, I have calculated the total amount of Riot that each different level of car asset can earn per day. This is making a couple of assumptions. First, we're using today's value for Riot and ETH, but those are obviously going to change and they don't necessarily move up in the exact proportion. I've also assumed that the average result is going to be second place. Naturally, if your renter is a good racer and finishing in first more often, you're going to do a little better than this. And conversely, if your renter is not really trying and getting a lot of third places, then you're going to earn less. And what do these numbers highlight for us? The first is that the output of Riot compared to the current floor doesn't always make sense. The most obvious place for this is with the Apollo cars at the Pro and Legendary level. The Legendary Apollo cars are going for about 3 times as much as the Pro versions are, and they don't output anywhere near 3 times as much Riot. So right now, without considering any collectability or cosmetic factors, which do have value as well, it does not make sense to buy a legendary car at all. On the flip side, a pro car looks like a pretty good purchase. You'll also notice that for some reason the prices on driver class cars have really shot up recently, and in the case of Apollo, when I was checking the floor, you could get a tracker class car, which is better, for less than the driver class car. That won't last very long, just an oddity in the marketplace, but we do notice trends like that. Recently, it was not uncommon to find a rally car right at the floor, even though they are clearly better than the rookie cars. Here, we're going to dive into a very simple ROI chart. Full disclosure, this is making several assumptions and does not include all factors, so don't make a purchase based strictly on these numbers. This is just here to help guide you. But to understand the chart, a couple of things. It's the same numbers that I had in the previous one, just all of the prices flipped to ETH so that the calculation would be simple. The ROI number is in days, and the floor price that you see is assuming you already have a driver. Choosing a driver is a much more complicated thing because there are a lot of factors to consider, and simply plugging a floor number in there to me isn't that helpful. So if you're going to be purchasing both, make sure that you add the cost of the driver that you want as well. Similar to the last chart, the value is in the same places. The pro cars look like a very good investment compared to legendary, and at the low end, there's not a whole lot of fluctuation in terms of the total number of days for ROI, except for at the moment, I would avoid driver class. So we've looked at the numbers. What do you need to provide to your renters to cover their needs so that they can be happy and get enough racing? And there's two camps of thought on this. The first one, which is much simpler, is it doesn't matter. You're just going to throw your stuff into the marketplace and let whomever rent them because they're going to use them, earn it, and send it back anyways. And I actually think that might be more popular because a serious grinder is going to be wanting to change their cars multiple times every single day so that they can get access to more stamina. And I'm not exactly sure how that is going to work out if you have a rental agreement with somebody specifically. I guess you could just say, hey, make sure you come back and get my cars first every single day. But really, if the marketplace is offering them a better split, then they're going to go that direction. And I'm not sure we're going to see the same kind of manager-scholar relationship that we saw happening in Axie. The second way to go is to replicate Axie. And in Axie Infinity, managers or owners would go out and find potential scholars, interview them, and make sure they found somebody that was going to be a good fit because they needed to work with that person. And in Axie Infinity, there's not a strict cap on how much each Axie can earn. The better the player is, the more each Axie is going to earn. So choosing good ones and having a positive relationship with a scholar that is working out for you is important. The other reason is that scholarships were tacked on to Axie Infinity from outside of the game, and that meant that there is some trust involved. So you want somebody that you can trust. In Riot Racers, that problem has been solved on day one, so it doesn't actually matter that much, and the assets all have a very clear cap. So it's not really about finding somebody who's good or bad. It's just about finding somebody that can enter into enough races every single day. If you are going that route, though, and wants to have a relationship with a scholar that makes sense, then you're going to want to keep a couple of things in mind. Number one, they need enough drivers with enough total stamina to cover all of the stamina for the cars that you provide them. So you can't just give them one driver and 6 cars and say, go max out all 6 cars, because they're only going to get through maybe 1.5 before the driver runs out of stamina, and they'll be waiting. That would force them to go out and rent a different driver from somebody else, and therefore reduce your earnings because now you only have the car being rented out. The other thing to keep in mind is that cars can only enter into races based on their current class. And a really nice breakdown for a potential renter would be to provide them 3 cars with 3 drivers, and the cars are Rally, Tracker, and Pro. If you have those 3 specifically, then you can enter into literally every single race that Riot Racers offers, with the one exception of legendary only races. Those will obviously require a legendary car, but there's not that many of them compared to the others, and legendary cars are rather expensive right now, so that's a really healthy spread. That might not be enough stamina to keep them happy, though, in which case you clearly want to give them more. And as long as you've got a variety, they're going to be able to enter into a variety of different races, and that will help them fill up their time and keep them happy. And that wraps up today's Riot Racers spawning and rentals strategy video. keep an eye out for future updates because once we have some real racing data, we will certainly update this video and see which assumptions I made that are correct, which ones need some adjustment. I hope you found today's video helpful, and if you did, consider giving us a follow on Twitter. That's where I like to answer your questions, and I'm talking play and earn gaming every single day. And double check that you've hit that like and subscribe button. It really helps support the channel.